All right, just want to quickly look at the 50s with a little civil rights. Start our 60s. Do, 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 do. Of course, with China going communist, it panics the United States into again this conflict with communism taking over the world. Where will it stop again? No one knows. But on Monday, I'm going to talk about the other essay question on the test, which is civil rights. And with civil rights, not looking at the ethical part of it, where we don't treat everyone equally as human beings. And an economic reason civil rights is a big issue is because we're underutilizing a large percentage of our population. We weren't educating African Americans the same as whites in this country by a great deal. And this will hopefully change. Well, of course, it hasn't changed this day, I don't think, but it's gotten better. But, and again, this is, we're not using this human capital, this human creativity of African Americans well. They were not allowed to have the same kind of education opportunities that whites had. In the 1950s, especially in the South and in the North, but if you were an African American going to school, you went to a school that was dilapidated. It had terrible textbooks. It did not have school buses. It was not heated, did not have bathrooms sometimes, where the white school would have all those amenities. Again, blacks and whites were segregated legally, right? Because there will be a question on the final about the Plessy versus Ferguson. This is a case in, I believe it's 1896, where the Supreme Court rules that segregation is legal in this country as long as there is equal services for blacks and whites. So it's allowed to have a colored only section of a train, which was actually Plessy versus Ferguson, was about the railroads. And of course, it's used in other places where, again, we don't allow blacks to stay in this hotel. So that was the legal situation in the United States up until 1954, when that will change. So Monday, again, I will outline this, but again, in the 1950s, we do get the start of the civil rights movement. Here's a movie. It's in Blackboard. It's an interesting movie. It's a half hour long, and it talks about this start of Brown versus Board of Education, which the Supreme Court will use to overturn Roe versus Wade. Roe versus Wade, excuse me, will overturn Plessy versus Ferguson. And we'll talk about this more in class. I'll show you where this movie is. But again, Brown versus Board of Education. It starts out with a bunch of young kids, a bunch of young high school students go on strike, African Americans, and they're looking for basically better facilities in their school system. They want what the whites have. And the NAACP, again, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, takes about 4 or 5 similar lawsuits and brings them all together as a class suit against, again, this segregated society, this rule of Plessy versus Ferguson. And they do win this case. But of course, what happens when they win the case, again, it's a 9-0 decision, right? The Supreme Court, there are 9 justices in the Supreme Court. They rule unanimously that Plessy versus Ferguson should be overturned because the segregation goes against the 14th Amendment, which is equal protection for all. But they say don't change it now, change it with all deliberate speed. They don't say within a year. Again, schools will have to be the same for whites and blacks. In 5 years, they have to be the same for whites and blacks with all deliberate speed. So they don't give a specific time, and things move slowly, right? That's what to remember if you do this essay on civil rights. It is a slow slog. We'll get a bunch of laws passed, as we'll see, but it takes a long time, of course, for human beings to adjust. Maybe we should adjust. Maybe I'm making excuses for people, but it is a slow process, and I still believe it's continuing to this day. Some people think that we don't have that much racism in this country, that we don't need affirmative action. I still think we do. Because, 1962, again, Brown versus Board of Education is in 1954. In 1962, they finally integrate Mississippi State. And James Meredith is allowed to go with police escort, of course, into a public college, into Mississippi State. The same thing happens in Alabama. It takes policemen, it takes the National Guard actually in Alabama, because the state police in Alabama do not want African Americans in the University of Alabama. And Eisenhower brings in the basically the National Guard. So Thurgood Marshall is the person that brings about, he's the head lawyer for Brown versus Board of Education. He will be a multiple choice question for us on the final, because he is this distinguished African American lawyer, and he will become the first African American Supreme Court justice. And he serves up into the 1990s. I forget exactly when. That he dies, because of course when you're selected for the Supreme Court, it's a lifelong position. And now we have Clarence Thomas took his place, another African American, but a very conservative one. So we'll talk about Mr. Galbraith later, Mr. Milton Friedman. I will talk about later. This is a conservative economist that becomes very prominent, and he starts in the 1950s in this University of Chicago, and he will become more important in the Reagan era, as we will talk about him. He is the reason, one of the reasons why we have no more military draft in this country, because he's a free market guy, and he thinks that, of course, people should freely choose to go into the Army to be a profession. So if you pay soldiers more, you make it so it's an alternative to a private citizen job. People will go to the military on their own volition, right? Freely, a free market again. Mr. Eisenhower, of course, is our president in the 50s. Just know what NATO is, as I said before. Again, these are these military organizations that are still around to this day. The North Atlantic Treaty Association. SEATO is the Southeast Asia Treaty Organization. Again, we want to build these international relations, and a lot of times they're to combat communism. Have they outlived themselves? Mr. Trump tried to make this point in a way, but I think he's come to realize that NATO has a vital role to play. MAD becomes our policy with atomic weapons, and MAD stands for this mutually assured destruction, that if we go to war with nuclear weapons with the Russians, we will annihilate each other. So it's a mutually assured destruction. And does this keep the peace? It is very true. It has. Sputnik, again, is launched, as I talked about last week, in 1957. This will bring about the space race. Again, brings about more math and science in the United States in schools. There's a lot more research and development paid by the government to private universities and public universities to do basic math and science research. So when that goes up, it just scares Americans that we're falling behind, right? After Sputnik, they put up poor Laka. You can see Laka the dog over here. Poor Laka. Laka comes down. A few months later, he goes up into space, and then he basically he runs out of air and dies, and then the satellite, the spacecraft, he goes up and eventually comes down a few months later and burns up on re-entry. We send up chimpanzees into space and we bring them back. Those godless communists, though, they don't. And again, you can read Mr. Johnson's quote about, again, we have to keep up with these people. Again, we got Castro in Cuba. There is Mr. Castro on the right, Che Guevara on the left. They basically overthrow this. On the far left is Mr. Batista. He is one of these military dictatorships. And again, there's a lot of U.S. mob connection, a lot of mafia connections into Cuba, in the government and running casinos. There's a lot of corruption, and Castro is a big draw for a lot of people. And again, this communist revolution, again, very effective. It's still there to this day. Their economy is in trouble, but We'll see. Here's Mr. Che. Again, Che Guevara. I'll probably talk about him in class. He's a young Argentinian doctor that goes off one summer to go work in northern South America, and he's driving a motorcycle, and he sees a lot of the hardships in South America. Again, this class distinction between the very rich and the very poor. Um, and basically, he gets attracted to Marxism. And he is a revolutionary, and he wants communism to spread around the world. He works with Castro in Cuba, and he's in Argentina, but he helps Castro. Then he will actually go to Africa and try to foment revolution in Africa. He comes back to South America and works in other countries. Bolivia, he's finally killed. But he's he's an interesting figure. He's deadly though, right? He kills people easily because if they're not they're not going to change into communism. They will not get the mindset of no property, egalitarian. You can easily kill them. So there's Mr. Reagan, of course, will be an anti-communist, Lord knows. Mr. Eisenhower, I think I'll talk about this when we come back. But the 60s are coming up. And again, we get Kennedy will become our president in 1960. He's elected in 1960. He is put in 1961. Again, for people doing the gender pay gap issue for their research paper, you should mention what Kennedy was one of the first ones that signs this act, the Paycheck Fairness Act, that tries to promote equal pay for men and women. He's also a big tax cutter, right, which people don't think of with Kennedy. He cut this income tax drastically, right? Again, the high rate was 91% for the wealthiest people in America. He cuts it to 65%. Today it's 39.6 and looks like it's going to stay there. Cut corporate tax rates from 52 to 47. He does create the Peace Corps. He does try to kill Castro. Poor Castro. I'm surprised Castro survived. We tried so many times to kill him. But of course, the space race continues in the 1960s. Kennedy vows to put somebody in the moon by the end of the decade, and he is successful. But again, the space race, if you do a Cold War, it should be mentioned because there's so many spillover effects with the technology discovered through research and development to create this space program for NASA to use. That it really helps the economy. Of course, Americans are always taught that John Glenn was the first man in space, but no, he is the second man in space. Yuri Gagarin is the first man in space. He goes up. He doesn't go all the way around the planet, though. John Glenn will circle the globe when he goes up. I think he does it 4 or 5 times. I think I'm remembering that correctly, but that's why we're taught in America he's the first man in space. So the 60s is a competition. Of course, we almost go to war with Cuba. We'll talk about that. Of course, we do go to war in Vietnam. I will talk about this more in class, but we'll get the 1960s. We'll start. In the 1960s, with your homework for this week, I believe. This is a big shift in the United States. It's a big paradigm shift. We start to look at ourselves and look how we interact in the world with ourselves differently. In the 1960s, this is individualism takes off, where we will get a complete change in, of course, fashion, and in music, and in art, and in writing, literature. It's a fascinating time. But against this rise of the individualism, before in the 1950s, it was kind of the epitome is where you would work for a large corporation and work there your whole life and do well and then retire. In the 1960s, it becomes more the individuality part. So it'll rise economically. It'll lead to the rise of these small startup businesses that will become very successful. But it is a fascinating time. Here is Dr. Timothy Leary here in the middle. He is a California professor. He's at Berkeley. He teaches sociology and psychology. But the sign says turn on, tune in, drop out. Mr. Timothy used to give his students LSD, acid, and have them observe the world. He thought it was a good thing because you could see alternative ways of looking at the world and yourself in the world when you're on LSD. So you could actually earn college credit for taking LSD. And there were a couple of colleges in the country that had that as a course. But we'll talk about the 60s and some of the changes go on because we'll see changes with the feminist movement, with civil rights, with the Native American movement. We'll see it with the Hispanic movement. And it's a fascinating time. We'll get the environmental movement will start. We'll get consumerism to start. Consumer protection will start in the 60s. It's a fascinating time, and again, it's a breakdown of looking up and thinking that business is on your side and the government's on your side, where it's more of a time they are against you, that you have to be careful of them. So the 60s is a more cynical time. But we'll talk. So I will see you on Monday. Email me if you have any questions. See if I can turn this thing off. I hope I'm recording. Yes, I am.